The King James Version sucks. And part of the reason my childhood Sunday school teacher would say that I shouldn't be using the word suck is part of the reason the King James Version sucks. Let me explain. Hi, I'm Jeremy. I'm a deep skeptic, also a pastor. But let's talk about some of the things that people say that are just not true. Like, it's the first English Bible. Just wasn't. Like Wycliffe, Tyndale, the Bishop's Bible, the Geneva. There are so many English translations that existed before the King James Version. It is in no way that. But it's the authorized version, right? The one that was authorized by God. No, it wasn't the authorized version authorized by God. It was authorized by King James. And if a king authorizes a Bible, it's gonna have issues. So some of the issues are that he gathered a group of scholars and he gave them some rules. And the rules were not super nefarious or super bad, but it needed to be based on the Bishop's Bible, which was not that great, but he said that's the one to base it on. So it's kind of a translation of another English text. And then he said, one of the things he said is hey, we need to make sure this doesn't insult the monarchy and make people want to be anti-monarchical. And a big thing he said was, just make sure when you're using words to describe the church in the Bible, make sure you use the same kind of words that we use today to describe our church structure. So use bishop and congregation, even though that's not how they ordered things in the first century. That early church did not do bishops and all of that kind of stuff. Those words aren't the right words. And when it came out, it was not popular. It was not popular because a lot of people said it was overly literal, literal to the sense that it messed up the meaning, because sometimes you can translate a literal word for word something into another language, and the word for word was not the right thing to do because it was a phrase that meant something else. And if you translate it correctly, it's translating the phrase into the modern language. So it was overly literal, and that was a problem. The other thing that they did was it was stilted language. Nobody has ever spoken like the words in the King James. They took the syntax of Hebrew or Greek or whatever. They took the syntax of that and put the words into that syntax, which is not how people spoke then and is not how people spoke now. So to say, oh, we're just speaking in an old form of the language, you're not. That's not how people spoke. And when the Bible came out, they're like, why would you translate a Bible into English, but translate it in a way that people can't really understand because they don't speak this way? Which meant that when it came out, it was not popular. And that was really frustrating to King James, who had authorized this version of the Bible. And so what did they do? Well, they made it the law of the land. They said, actually, this is going to be the only Bible that is available. The only Bible that is, wait for it, authorized. And once they did that, once they outlawed the other translations of the Bible and those things went out of print, guess what? There was only one Bible left, and it boosted the sales of that Bible, and then it was popular. But it didn't always stay popular. And then later in history, there was this moment of the Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening. And in those moments, the Bible that was most easily available to them was the King James Version of the Bible. And so they picked it up, and that became the Bible that was happening during these really important moments in church history. Okay, so the other thing is that it has errors. It has multiple really difficult and frustrating errors. Some of the errors are in the language itself. Let me explain one that happens in Jude. It's sort of the classic example. So here it is, the book of Jude. Jude 1:22. It's actually Jude 22 because it's only got one chapter. But it says, have compassion, making a difference. And it sounds like when you read that, it sounds like, oh, let's have compassion on people. That'll make a difference in the world. But that phrase, make a difference, and have compassion, make a difference, that phrase means something very different in the modern world. Make a difference is like, hey, make a difference in someone's life. you see a commercial that asks you to donate to animal relief, and you think in the arms of the angels, and you start crying, and you give your money to the animals. You make a difference. But that's not what that word meant. That way of understanding that phrase comes from like the 1900s. And so when you look at what it actually meant in the King James Version, it means like make a difference between two things, make a distinction between two things. That's really different. And what it's basically saying is have compassion and make a difference between the thing. Like have a compassionate heart that is trying to distinguish between the different things. Now, that sounds great. That's what the King James Version says, except so let's just pause right there, because the problem that exists there and throughout the King James Version is that the meaning of words and phrases have changed to the modern time. And so you can read make a difference in the King James Version and think you understand it because we have a phrase make a difference today, but the phrase we have today does not have the same meaning as it had when the King James Version was being written. So this verse actually reveals something else, the other major problem with the King James Version. It was written on texts that are newer than the texts that we have access to today. And there are differences between the newer texts and the more ancient texts. And the more ancient texts are more clear. They're more accurate because, of course, they are closer to the original text. And here's the thing, that verse in Jude, there's a change in the case of the word, of the words there, that means a more accurate translation is to have compassion on people who are trying to make a distinction, who are trying to figure things out, who might have doubts or questions. It's saying, have compassion on the people who doubt and have questions. By the way, those people are me. I always have doubts and questions, and so please have compassion on me. That's what the original manuscripts would say, but it's not what the King James manuscripts say, and it's not their fault. It's not the translator's fault of the King James. They just had less old manuscripts to draw from. And that's why it's one of the many reasons why it's not a great translation. So the King James Version just sucks. And I'm really sorry to be the one to have to tell this to you. Nobody really has a business reading the King James Version because it's so wildly inaccurate and hard to read. I mean, unless you're a Bible scholar, yeah, I get that. Maybe you want to read it for historical value and to figure out why it's so wrong. But for most people, you don't need to read it. You need a more modern translation. I like the New Revised Standard Updated Edition or the CEB, the Common English Bible. I think those are both much more accessible and much more accurate. And the reason I bring this up, not being a scholar, is because if you're trying to figure out the beliefs that work for you, especially if you're trying to figure out beliefs that work for you that are based in the Bible, you need a Bible translation that's accurate, that helps you do that. A Bible translation that is easy to understand, and the King James just is not it. Put it away. Get you a better translation and use that to help you figure out what it is you believe, and do it in community. We've got one here.